Hi, this is Jon Jordan, PocketGamer.biz, and we're just going to go through some of the key trends that affected games in 2014 and are going to be impacting the industry in 2015. First one, return of paid. So as we all know, paid games have been coming back in quite a significant way. We've seen particularly recently with Us2's Monument Valley, which has done about $6 million of revenue, particularly on iOS. We're particularly seeing with Apple, it's as a curated platform, it seems to be focusing more heavily on small indie developers who are doing paid games. It just seems to be a tendency of the kind of stuff that's being featured. And equally, for the smaller indies who fail to do the big free-to-play games that are games as a service need to be updated pretty much at least once a week. They just don't have the big teams and the big services and the big data analysis to do that. So we're seeing a big kind of recoiling of these smaller, certainly smaller than 10-man teams, who are going back to really kind of console days. They're going back to making small, highly polished, paid-for content, and they're seeing a reaction to that from the audience, particularly in terms of the more hardcore gaming audience, who've never liked free-to-play and just want the kind of quality expectation they have when they have a paid game. Trend number 2, demonization of free-to-play games. So 2014, we kind of expected that everyone would agree that free-to-play is, if not the best way of playing games, certainly one of the best ways of playing games. That completely didn't happen. Not only did we see a backlash from the hardcore guys who continue to hate free-to-play games, we also started to see a backlash from regulators, governmental agencies all the way around the world. We had kind of seen this previously in 2013 in Japan, where they brought in some laws about how much you could charge minors in free-to-play games, but we thought the Japanese market was a bit different, a bit special, wouldn't really affect anywhere else. What we've seen in 2014 is in Europe, in the US and in the UK, kind of regulators looking at the free-to-play model, trying to put some kind of legal framework over it. There's not to date been hard kind of laws changed, but there's certainly been recommendations about how much you should kind of monetize certain levels. There's even been some hilarious things where people have suggested certain games had too long a kind of a waiting kind of gating times, notably EA's Dungeon Keeper, which was hilarious if governments want to get involved in game design, but that's the way it is. But the whole thing is that we're kind of seeing these two kind of double-pronged attacks really on free-to-play. We're seeing it still from a certain level of gamers who don't dislike the kind of design of free-to-play games, and we're seeing a kind of backlash of people who are kind of, I guess, a bit more societally worried about people spending a lot of money, and I guess we'll see a lot more people, erroneously in my opinion, comparing free-to-play games with gambling. So will free-to-play games win out in the end? Clearly, in terms of the amount of revenue going through them, free-to-play games have won the audience. I guess the big thing ongoing that will kind of kick up another fuss, potentially in 2015, is how Steam operates in free-to-play. There are free-to-play games on Steam, but if that market goes heavily free-to-play in the way that app stores have done, I think we're going to see even more of a backlash. The third trend is user acquisition, so this horrible term we all use, UA. So with UA, clearly there's a lot of stuff going on, but basically all that means is advertising really. It's a more kind of performance advertising way of getting users. For mobile games, that's been about buying users in various advertising manner. What we've kind of seen with user acquisition is, as we kind of expect, for the key markets it's got more expensive as more companies are trying to compete for those users. What we've kind of seen though in 2014 is the key winners in this free-to-play market, so the Supercells, the Kings, the Gung-Hos, the Machine Zones, they just have so much money they can basically outbid anyone for the kind of key audiences. So we kind of had this kind of everyone, unless you're one of these big kind of companies who really can spend, you're kind of looking at least $500,000 to spend if you want to have any impact really. So most companies clearly can't do that. So in some ways we're kind of seeing user acquisition kind of become useless to most people. In some ways that's kind of driving more extreme user acquisition. So we're seeing this, a lot of these companies now at the top end, we're seeing kind of big TV ad campaigns. So we saw that from a company called Ucool in America with their game. We've seen it clearly from King, we've seen it from Supercell. We see it in some markets more than others. Korea is a very big TV market. I think we'll see it generally in all Western markets. We're going to see more kind of a TV advertising of mobile games. In some other ways, user acquisition isn't a bad thing in its own right. If you can find the right market, it's a clear way of, you spend a certain amount of money, maybe $2 or $3, and you get a download. What you do with that download is then up to your game design. In some ways it's become very commoditized as well. So with the rise of Facebook, which probably takes about a third of user acquisition money at the moment for games, that's just if you have £500,000 to spend, then you can spend it in a quite effective way, and that's good for your business. Clearly for the people who can't do that, we're seeing a kind of recall. Partly that's has helped the rise of paid games, which have a different kind of advertising option that But equally, we're seeing lots of people talking about Twitter now. Will Twitter become as powerful as Facebook? It's not as big an audience, but it's kind of in some ways more powerful, more mobile, more now, as some people describe it. And equally, we're kind of seeing kind of other clever ways. So obviously, YouTube has obviously been a big thing for a long time, but the kind of the rise of the YouTubers, we're kind of seeing a lot of kind of advertising dollars and creativity more than advertising dollars going into that. So so the Finnish company seriously did quite a big deal, or have done quite a few big deals, not in monetary terms, but for their game Best Fiends, and they've had quite a big impact on that. So I think we'll see more creative uses of the social media. So our fourth trend is my little joke of being stasis there, not moving. So clearly what we've seen in 2014 is not much movement at the very top of the top grossing chart. Partly that's just an economic outcome of those games making so much money now, they can then spend so much more money attracting the new generation of gamers that no one else can get a look in. Just no one has deep enough pockets because you can generate so much money at the top grossing charts now. Kind of famously, of the top 10 top grossing games at the end of 2014, 7 of them were also the top grossing games in 2013. And the ones that kind of had changed were kind of like sequels, or so we had Candy Crush Saga and Candy Crush Soda Saga, which is kind of effectively a sister app. That's how King call it. I mean, that was now a top grossing game, but that's sort of kind of riding on the coattails. There have been a few others which we'll talk about in our later trends piece, but basically it's very hard to break into that real kind of top of the charts, and this causes a problem for people. And it's in some ways it's not a bad thing, because it forces people to think about other ways of how they kind of find success in the games. Maybe the top grossing iPhone games market is not something to look at. Maybe you need to look at other kind of platforms. Maybe you need to look at other markets. Obviously the US market is fairly static. Most of the European markets have been fairly static, but maybe some of the smaller markets, so maybe the Vietnamese market or the Indian market or the Indonesian market, are not very static. But it's kind of, in general, the stasis is kind of generally seen as a bad thing because just nothing's changing. So, but maybe in the end, we just need to stop looking at the top grossing chart. We need to start thinking about other ways of discovery. So I guess with all things in the world, wherever there's a problem, it causes strengths and weaknesses, and the most creative people will use take on the weaknesses to create their own strengths. So our fifth trend is dynamism. So following on from a fourth trend that was stasis, it's kind of like a glass half full situation. It's the other side of the coin. Wherever you see a market that's static, the mobile games industry is just never static. There's just so much going on. There's so much global reach. There's so many new companies coming in. There's so much growth going on that nothing ever is static over the entirety of the market. So clearly we have markets, geographical markets that are growing very fast. So the Chinese market still grew maybe like 90% in 2014. That will still grow 50% in 2015. We have markets that are kind of really nascent, so kind of India is often used as an example, Indonesia, similar, a lot of Southeast Asia, so Vietnam, Philippines. I mean, these are very large population groups that they're following the trend a couple of years behind everyone else of finally getting smartphones. A lot of Android phones going in there, cheap Android phones, sure, and obviously the population is not rich in the way that the Western European market is rich. But there's just a lot of people out there who haven't really played mobile games yet, so there's going to be a lot of kind of dynamism in that. And clearly, even for Western developers, we might think you're not going to have the big free-to-play hit now, but virtual reality is clearly going to be a trend, whether it's a big hit in 2015, maybe 2016. Wearables, lots of question marks, maybe it will go nowhere, but there's always lots of new kind of markets, there's always new technology coming in, there's always new ways of making games for some sort of computing hardware. And even in terms of trends, we can kind of say, Match 3 and Clash of Clans type clones, those strategy games, kind of overdone a little bit, well, massively overdone. But what's the next new thing to come out? Will someone finally make a MOBA stick? Will a hybrid MOBA come out? Well, there's lots of different genres, and you only need to have a few people kind of breaking into that market, and suddenly you're the next big thing. When you just have a global audience of billions of people playing games, the next Flappy Bird is always around the corner. Our sixth trend is a kind of a contradictory one, I guess. So in some ways we have a global village now. In some ways it's the whole Marshall McLuhan thing. The whole world is closed into one kind of location where everyone kind of can see what's going on. And certainly when it comes to app stores, with the exception of perhaps China, pretty much anything that's on Google Play and on the Apple App Store is pretty much going to all territories. So you can have a hit that suddenly goes virally globally. I mean, Flappy Birds is the obvious example, and suddenly this kind of like mass audience can be engaged very, very quickly. Similarly, we have this kind of like thinking local thing. So that's the exact opposite. Even though most games can be available globally, most audiences certainly not necessarily nationality audience, but certainly cultural audiences, to have a very kind of keenly kind of attuned to what kind of content they like. So you maybe some games, maybe a Clash of Clans that has a lot of advertising money, or a Candy Crush Saga, maybe those can be marketed universally in the same way that Disney can be marketed universally. But for most markets, and certainly when we see in Asia, so certainly for China, Japan and Korea, those markets are heavily focused from local content. So it's local developers, local publishers coming up with certain gaming styles that are different, coming up with certain brands that are different. And I kind of guess we're going to see every year, certainly 2015, we're going to see kind of a conflict between this kind of, you can address every market, any developer anywhere in the world can address any market, but equally the most lucrative markets are going to be probably niche markets, partly because you don't have to pay so much in terms of user acquisition to engage with those markets. So our seventh trend is the power of Kardashian. Obviously, just not the power of Kardashian, the power of brands really, but the best example of how brands have kind of really worked with the mobile gaming audience is kind of the slightly peculiar, in many ways, before the event, kind of Kim Kardashian game from Glue. So certainly I had only the slightest of opinion of who Kim Kardashian was before I started playing the game, and after about a year of playing it every day, I don't necessarily know why Kim Kardashian is famous, but certainly I know a bit more about her and her family and her manager and her mum and all that kind of crazy stuff. Why is this interesting? Well, famously now, Glue pretty much had a game called Stardom Hollywood, which didn't go anywhere, didn't have any celebrities in it, didn't have any brands in it. Basically reskinned it, put Kim Kardashian in it, and it worked really well. So it's clearly not the gameplay that's engaging people, it's the fact that Kim Kardashian was a very obvious brand. So people see a game who are Kim Kardashian fans, they see it in the App Store, they download it, they talk to their friends, see people like me who don't know who Kim Kardashian is, see everyone's playing Kim Kardashian, oh well, I'll try that game out, see if I like it. So kind of brands clearly are good in terms of getting users. There's a kind of argument about whether brands mean you have to spend less on user acquisition. There's a lot of people who kind of work with movies tend to say while working with a brand will get you more users, you still have to do the user acquisition to kind of, and you just get more effect. So you can't sometimes go, I'm going to buy a brand and then not do any marketing on it. That's not how it works. Kind of more subtly, actually, talking to Kabam, who like Glue are doing a lot of licensing deals with movies. They kind of say a brand often gives you a wider audience, but also a more engaged audience than you would get. So they have a game for the Hunger Games film, and it's quite a hardcore kind of card battling game. And I'm sure a lot of that audience wouldn't really engage with card battling games other than the fact it has Jennifer Lawrence on the icon. So we kind of see brands as a way of both kind of overcoming the cost of user acquisition and a way of kind of leveraging user acquisition as well. It's the other thing quickly to mention is brands are kind of interesting, but people aren't really licensing movie brands in the same way as they did before, because games are as a service now, and the way Kim Kardashian works really well is Kim Kardashian is a live person, she is a celebrity, she's always doing stuff. You can follow Kim Kardashian on Twitter, and she's going to get married, she's going to have a kid, she's going to maybe now have another kid and get divorced, or whatever happens in her life will be to some degree reflected in the game. So by partnering with a real life celebrity, Glue have basically now have their game as a service, which is attached to a person as a service, which is effectively what a celebrity is. And so you have this kind of incredible synergy of anything she does in the real world can then feed back into the game. So the eighth trend is whatever happened to Publishers 2.0. So Publishers 2.0 is a bit of a kind of a term, I mean not necessarily I invented, but a term that we spoke about a lot on PocketGamer.biz. So we had publishers in the retail model, we knew what publishers did, and they had money, they could get your game onto shelf space at Christmas, the key periods. There was a lot of argument between developers about whether publishers did anything else. They obviously did PR, they did marketing, they maybe did some kind of QA, but a lot of that stuff wasn't seen as being very useful. In the kind of the digital world, in the mobile world, the initial reaction was we don't need publishers anymore, we can make our game, put it on the App Store and job done. Clearly now that's not the case. People still need money, so publishers can provide money, but other people can provide money as well. But the idea of Publishers 2.0 were they weren't publishing in the same way, they were perhaps providing niche services. And sometimes we're kind of seeing that now with a company like Tilting Point, which don't even publish the game. So if you're a developer who work with them, they won't put their name on the App Store, your name will go on it, but they'll provide certain services, a lot of data, maybe some money, maybe some user acquisition. That's kind of a smart way of working. Interestingly, particularly for Tilting Point, they've kind of finessed their model a little bit, so they will do some publishing now as well, because sometimes it's better for them to have, they have better kind of relationships with Apple and Google, so maybe that they can kind of leverage a bit of that publishing. So you're kind of seeing, maybe you're seeing publishers 2.5 kind of come back in now, but equally you're seeing lots of crazy people become publishers. So people who do a lot of marketing, so there's a company called Fixu who do user acquisition, they're getting back into the publishing game. You have traditional publishers doing publishing like they always did before, and then you have some kind of developers who were developers, been really successful, and they kind of become publishers as well. So a good example of that is Creative Mobile in excuse me, in Estonia. So they've been very successful on Android with some of their racing games, and now they're kind of publishing games under their own license. So I think publishing is always there. Quite what we call those kind of companies is probably a moot point. So ninth trend, it's kind of split in two ways. So one, Germany on the rise. Finland on decline? Well, who knows? Maybe slightly kind of weird trends. Countries clearly are not on the decline. What we're looking at is kind of like the performance of companies within those countries. So clearly Finland has been at the forefront, certainly in North America and Western Europe, of mobile games. We had Rovio, the biggest mobile company to come out of the initial App Store, followed by Supercell, again the biggest company in the West to come out of the App Store. Both of those happen to be based in Helsinki. Since then we've seen kind of Finland, partly because it has had those successes, partly because it's built up these big companies, and certainly some of them like Rovio have started to kind of shed jobs. You start to have kind of like the effect that people who understand the market very well, do their own startups, because they've been successful they get funding. So particularly in Finland we've seen a lot of startups understand free-to-play very well, understand brands very well, setting up their studios and getting, you know, fairly substantial sums of money, you know, $5 million, you know, some up to $10 million to build the next generation. So we're almost in Finland, we're seeing on the third generation of mobile games companies. You could argue the fourth perhaps. I guess the interesting thing is we've seen some of those companies release some games in 2014, and those games haven't really caught the market. They've not been successful. Obviously, it's very hard to make a free-to-play hit. Most of the games that are released in the free-to-play mobile games market will not be successful. This is not a criticism per se of Finland, but I think it's interesting that it's a country that has been seen as being the kind of heartland of mobile games. And now all we're seeing is that it's very hard to make successful mobile games now, whether you're in Finland or in the UK or in Japan or anywhere. So this is a slightly journalistic kind of creation, but I think interesting to watch nevertheless. So Germany on the rise. I guess what's really interesting in Germany, Germany always got free-to-play games. Germany was massive in PC browser games. And for the initial generation of free-to-play mobile games, those companies just couldn't reinvent themselves. They couldn't kind of work out what the differences between browser games were and mobile games. And there's a massive difference. There's a difference in terms of how long people play. There's a difference in terms of how you find that audience. There's a difference in terms of the type of games that people want to consume on those platforms. We've finally seen now, I think, in 2014, a good rise of German companies. So again, it's maybe startups, it's maybe people coming out of Big Point, it's people coming out of Gameforge, setting up new companies, getting new funding, going through a couple of kind of iterations of their own games, and now coming out and doing, you know, proving they can do free-to-play games. So Flare Games, I guess, are the prime example of a company that its founders came out of an existing browser-based game company, set up, just do mobile games, and they seem to be very, well, don't say very successful, they seem to be doing pretty well at the moment. We'll see how they get on this year. And similarly, we've seen like a company like Anno Games do very hardcore PC browser games. Taken them a few years, but now they're putting those games on mobile as well. So a bit less of a kind of disruptive approach, but they're kind of taking existing content. They've worked out how to kind of change the user interface, and maybe they're just kind of their existing PC players are now playing on mobile as well. But we've kind of seen, you know, those German developers. They were a bit behind everyone else now. Maybe now they're kind of rising up, and it'd be interesting to see how those kind of two countries play out throughout 2015. UK, I don't really think that there's been much change now. So the UK can do better. We can do better, lads. Come on. Okay, so now to my last trend. Being a journalist, you always have to kind of fit in more than people expect. So my last trend is there's loads of trends. There's just, you know, whenever we say there's 10 trends, there's always lots more trends we could put in. So I'm not going to go into detail on these things, but clearly there's just so much going on in the mobile market. I think China's interesting. My own feeling is we understand the Chinese market fairly well now. Actually, it's quite a mature market. It's growing very fast, but to many, I think within China, that growth is now baked in. People kind of know what's going on. The smart Chinese companies are now looking outside China. They're either coming to the West, they're looking into Southeast Asia. We kind of have this. We've mentioned social networks a few times. There's loads of social networks, particularly on mobile. So there's Kakao, there's Line, there's WeChat, there's Viber, there's WhatsApp, there's Telegraph even. I mean, there's just new stuff coming up all the time. How those are interacting with mobile games is always changing. So we know Line has now done a deal with greed to do first-party games. We know Kakao's still extremely strong in Korea, but is it becoming less strong? You know, what's going to happen with WhatsApp? There's Tango as well. There's all this kind of stuff going on. There's a lot of dynamism in that space, but equally, you know, that some of those things can be saturated quite quickly. Other things we've got going on, smart TV. Is smart TV ever going to go anywhere? Again, there's another push with Android TV. Is that going to change anything that we've seen before? Is Apple ever going to do anything in this space? I think the underlying trend, this is a very boring one, it's the kind of thing that makes me happy, but most other people doesn't, but consolidation when it comes to companies. So a merger and acquisition, actually 2014 was actually pretty sizable for the game space. You had some pretty big deals going on there. You had Twitch, you had Microsoft buying Mojang. You had even kind of stuff with Supercell's shares being kind of sold around. There's a lot of money going on there. I think that could be seen as nice consolidation. That's kind of like that's kind of nice acquisition. I think 2015 we're going to see a bit nasty kind of M&A acquisition. We're going to see a lot of companies who had venture funding basically not have proved their business model, basically going to get bought for $1 or something. You know, I think particularly in some of the more kind of bubbly markets like particularly China, where it's very unclear how valuations of those companies have come about. We're going to see, you know, kind of deals we didn't expect to happen, companies who we thought were quite strong are going to collapse. So I think there's going to be a lot of kind of interesting news, certainly from a journalistic point of view. And I kind of think there's some wider things as well that aren't necessarily about mobile games. I kind of think we're all a bit surprised about console. Console, we kind of expected to be a bit kind of these generation of consoles to be the kind of like really the last ones. We didn't expect to really see PlayStation 4 and Xbox One really find the kind of strength they have, but they're still proven. I mean, it's still interesting. Is there a next generation of consoles? What's the point of a box with a brand on? The fact that it's a box with a brand on maybe is the most interesting thing. And I guess kind of the last thing is does hardware really matter at all in general? You know, we kind of had things, Steam boxes. Will Steam boxes happen? What's Steam? You know, Steam's not really a mobile platform, but could it be? Is Steam going to go free to play? We're kind of seeing actually the rise of, in general, just the rise of content. So developers are not mobile developers, they're not PC developers. Games pretty much now go over everywhere, and that in its own way is disruptive.